My name is Lauren Upton, and I teach literature, rhetoric, and public speaking and debate at WTMA. After 25 years as a trial attorney, I decided that teaching young minds was ever so much more rewarding. I've taught in grades K through 12, both in person and online, with a focus on literature, writing, and history for 10 years. I've also taught writing and rhetoric at the collegiate, graduate, and professional levels, and have been coaching speech and debate for 15 years. I love teaching literature because of the profound impact that great works of literature can have on students' lives. Literature provides a rich tapestry of human experiences, emotions, and ideas, which allows me to engage students in meaningful discussions about the complexities of the human condition. In reading and discussing literature with students, I hope to ignite a love of reading and learning, empowering them to navigate the complexities of the world with wisdom and insight. I also love teaching rhetoric, both written and oral, because of the profound impact it can have on students' abilities to communicate effectively and persuasively. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, empowers students to articulate their thoughts with clarity, coherence, and conviction. Through the study of rhetoric, I strive to help students develop critical thinking skills, enabling them to analyze arguments, identify fallacies, and construct their own persuasive messages. I also hope to foster my students' confidence in their communication abilities, preparing them to navigate a world where effective communication is essential for success. In my courses, students can expect to be actively involved. My courses are highly interactive. In my literature courses, for example, students will have read the work we are discussing in any given week before the class session. During each class, we discuss the historical, social, and cultural contexts in which these works were produced, and we discuss the thematic complexities and stylistic techniques used by the authors. I anticipate that every student will want to jump into the conversation, but there's always the expectation that they do so. Students can respond to my questions, they can pose their own, they can respond to questions of peers. Students tend to find that because of this, the classes fly by and they're usually sorry that we don't have time to continue the discussion. My writing courses are similar. Students complete reading assignments before each class, and during class, I'll review the concepts and techniques that were covered in the reading. But I also expand on that material with examples and demonstrations of contextual usage. I pose questions, which allows students to demonstrate their understanding of the material, and I have you try segments in which students have the opportunity to practice the skill we've focused on by working on examples that have been posted to class slides. In all of my courses, there are weekly writing assignments to be completed after class, which further allows students to practice and demonstrate their understanding of the material. There are also major projects each semester, which allow students to demonstrate their synthesis of the material we've learned in a longer format. I have an open door policy. If a student ever has a question about any of the material or any of the projects, I'm happy to work with them to answer that question, either by email or in office hours. The following is a sample of what a typical literature class might look like, with answers modeled on those I've received from students in the past. I hope you find it interesting. All right. Today we are digging into what were some of the first short stories that were published in the New World. A bit of background about our author before we get started. So he was a bit of a tragic figure from the beginning. He had a lonely and difficult childhood. His parents were itinerant actors, so they were away a lot. But they also both died when he was quite young, and he was left to be raised by a foster father who clearly loved him, but it doesn't seem like he liked him very much. Poe actually left home fairly young, seemingly to get away from the foster father. And he first went to UVA, University of Virginia, where he had a bit of difficulty. And so he went from there to West Point, where he also had a bit of difficulty. And he wound up moving to Baltimore, Maryland to try his hand at writing. He was able to get some of his short stories published in a local Baltimore newspaper, but they were so creepy that the paper actually received complaints. However, he was a prolific and varied author. He wrote poems, he wrote essays, he wrote literary criticism in addition to his short stories, so he was able to get by. Poe is actually credited with introducing a new form of short fiction, the detective story, in his tales featuring the Parisian crime solver C. Auguste Dupin. My apologies to the French speakers. He, of course, was the detective in the Purloined Letter, which you read for today's assignment. Interestingly, the word detective did not exist in the English language at the time that Poe was writing. However, the genre, as you well know, has become one of the preeminent genres of the 20th and 21st centuries in both literature and film. Dupin and his techniques, his psychological inquiry have informed countless detectives since Poe wrote about him. He informed, Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle talks about, modeling Holmes on Dupin a little bit. He also shows up metaphorically in Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, and even in the horror novels of Stephen King. Fittingly, Poe died under mysterious circumstances when he was just 40. He was found in the street in clothes that were not his own, and he was delirious. His death has been attributed to everything from rabies to a brain tumor, and we still don't know why he died. It's a mystery. How appropriate. With that, let's dig in. So, Poe, in addition to his detective stories, was one of the earliest writers of what has become known as early American Gothic. American Gothic descended from Gothic literature, which had its ascendance in the late 18th century and remained quite popular throughout the 19th century. What do you think of when you hear the term Gothic, which we sometimes shorten to Goth today? As an aside, this is where I would introduce the students to the elements of Gothic literature. And I would tease out the elements with which they might be familiar, and I would introduce the quintessential elements with which they are not. There'd be a brief discussion of other literary works that would fall under the heading of Gothic literature in the literary canon. And I would also discuss the distinctions between kind of early Gothic literature and American Gothic literature. Back to the lecture. Poe's tales were quintessentially Gothic. Murder, death, madness, grief, psychological horror. Those were all very common themes in his work. So let's start with The Telltale Heart, which you also read for today. First, we've talked about point of view. What point of view did Poe use? Yes, first person point of view. Exactly. And what is revealed about the narrator in the opening lines of the story? Yes, reader learns that the narrator has been ill, although presumably he is telling us that he's been physically ill, right? Reader also learns that someone, according to the narrator, the reader, has said that he has lost control of his mind, right? He's gone mad. Of course, yes, the narrator denies that there's anything wrong with his mental health. He declares the disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. What is he trying to convince the reader? Yeah, not only that he's perfectly sane, but that he can prove it. Good. Okay, we've also talked about tone before. What is the tone that we are experiencing in the story? Yeah, the first paragraph, we kind of, through that first person point of view, start to get a sense of a little desperation. Maybe not quite to hysteria yet, but certainly a sense of desperation. He tries to say, "Oh, I'm presenting myself healthily and calmly." So it's hard to know whether he's quite as mad as he insists that he isn't. But where do you see in the text, where do you first begin to get the sense that the narrator is not as sane as he alleges? Yes, He claims that he heard all things in the heaven and in the earth, and then there's that ellipsis, and in hell. The reader starts to get that sense that perhaps he's not quite as sane as he says that he is. And now you do start to get the tone coming across as a little bit desperate. What technique does Poe use to show this desperate state? Yeah, the broken speech pattern, right? Those dashes and exclamation points. That starts to give this building sense of perhaps hysteria. Now, I mentioned that when we are looking at Gothic literature, certainly if you are looking at traditional Gothic literature from Europe, you are dealing with a crumbling castle as the setting, right? In American Gothic, it tends to be more like an abandoned house or something. What is the physical setting in this story? Yes, the old man's house. What is the real setting? Yeah, we get told about the small house where they're living, right? But the majority of the story is actually occurring in the thoughts of the narrator rather than in the physical setting of the house, right? The fact that there are very few details given about the house suggests that his mind is the true setting. What do the few details that are given, the door, the clocks, the floorboards, the death watchers in the walls, what do those all suggest? Yeah, they contribute to this sense of confinement, right? And that's another element of Gothic literature, being constrained or confined. Good. Now, as I mentioned, another prominent element of Gothic literature is madness, right? And we've certainly talked about the beginning senses of it at the beginning. But how does Poe demonstrate irrationality in this story? He does it in a variety of ways. Yep, partly through the narrator's increasingly bizarre story, right? In the beginning, the reader might be willing to believe him that when he says he's not mad, but as the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that he's not totally rational, right? What's the first suggestion that the narrator's story is irrational? Yeah, the reference to the evil eye. Most people, would recognize that in an older man, which the narrator has told us this fellow is, and particularly old, right? The narrator is, by the way, moved in to help this guy. Older people can develop glaucoma, they can develop cataracts, their eyes can take on kind of a milky appearance that would be expected in somebody of an advanced age like this, right? But the narrator just jumps to this kind of irrational place, not kind of, really irrational place. It's an evil eye, right? What else does he say? Yes, he believes that he can hear the beating of the old man's heart. And not only that he can hear it, but that the neighbors next door can hear it. Right. And then that the police can hear it, even though it's been buried under the floorboards. This is not a rational person, right? So all of these references to madness also suggest an unreliable narrator. What is an unreliable narrator? Right. A storyteller who is, either withholding information, outright lying to you, and you find out later in the game that there's been a, proactive lie. They may be misleading you intentionally or no, but they're casting doubt on the narrative, right? How does Poe's use of the unreliable narrator impact your understanding of the story, or any reader's understanding of the story? Right. Creates this tension, right? Between the narrator says at the beginning, I'm going to prove to you, effectively, I'm going to prove to you that I'm sane. And then we find out what he's done. And this unfolding sense is it's delaying our conclusion as to whether he is sane or not, right? On top of this, there seems to be tension within the narrator himself. What other uncertainty does the use of an unreliable narrator lead to? Yeah, because the story is taking place largely within his mind, you start getting these questions. Is he trying to convince the reader that he's sane? Or is he trying to convince himself that he's sane? What do you think? Was he actually sane when he killed the old man? And after that, the discussion would continue. We would discuss other literary devices such as motifs and symbols. We'd look for connections with other works that we've previously discussed, finding through lines where appropriate. It's usually a wonderful way to spend time with young people. I hope that you found some of this interesting, and I very much hope that at some point I get to meet your students in the future.